My name is Jamie Duncan, and I'm a researcher at the University of Winnipeg Center for Access to Information and Justice, as well as an affiliate of the Ethics of AI Lab at the University of Toronto Center for Ethics. Today, it is my great pleasure to be in conversation with Alexander McClelland and Alex Luscombe. Alexander McClelland is a socio-legal researcher and a Banting postdoctoral fellow at the University of Ottawa's Department of Criminology. His research focuses on the intersections of life, law, and disease as they relate to issues of criminalization, sexual autonomy, surveillance, drug liberation, and the construction of knowledge on HIV. Alex Luscombe is a PhD student at the University of Toronto's Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies. His research focuses on issues of policing, economic crime, and access to criminal justice data. He's also a researcher at the Center for Access to Information and Justice at the University of Winnipeg. Today, we're here to talk about their Policing the Pandemic project. Their website, policingthepandemic.ca, details how the Policing the Pandemic mapping project was launched on April 4th, 2020 to track and visualize expansions of police power in response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the unequal patterns of enforcement that may arise as a result. The project aims to bring light to COVID-19 related patterns of police intervention to help understand who's being targeted, what justifications are being used by police, and how marginalized communities are being impacted. So just to get started, could you tell me a bit about how this all started?
Sure. Thanks for that introduction, Jamie, and thanks for the Center for Ethics for having us. Our project is grounded in the outcomes of research on the criminalization of HIV in Canada and the harmful and unjust and unequal patterns of enforcement which emerge in that context, which are highly racialized, highly gendered, and highly classed. Canada is a leading country in the world for mobilizing police in the criminal justice system to address HIV, and that has only harmed our collective health. So our project, the Policing the Pandemic Mapping Project, was started out of concern that this would only reproduce itself in a new way with COVID. We began documenting and tracking all forms of enforcement of COVID to help understand what was happening on the ground, to help put into question the practice of enforcing a pandemic, to help scrutinize the idea of policing as a legitimate response in this context, so that we'd be well positioned to call attention to harms that would inevitably be result from the process.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie, and for Marcus for having us on here. And just to add to that, what Alex and I basically did for this project was, without getting into kind of too many of the technical details, we basically built an online platform, which is policingthepandemic.ca. And how it works is that we basically populate an Excel file with a variety of information from across the country, like kind of where a reported enforcement action related to COVID happened, how much a person was fined, the known demographic characteristics of the person, and so on. And I should say, we're at the moment, just because it's the only data available, we're mostly getting that from newspaper articles, police press releases, and the occasional social media posts at the moment. But what we do with it then is we populate this Excel file and we represent this information in an interactive map that's on the website, as well as a searchable database that people can explore and use freely for their own kind of journalistic, academic, other purposes. So just looking at it before this, so far since we launched it about 2 months ago, we've had over 20,000 people visit the website from about 50 different countries and are finding new reports and making use of the project and the data that we put on it almost every day, which is definitely far more than we could have hoped for when we first launched it.
Awesome, thanks. So the project and your white paper associated with it use the term countermapping, and I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about what this means.
Sure. So the concept of countermapping, broadly speaking, it kind of refers to basically efforts to map against dominant power structures in the name of some larger goal. So you're basically treating mapping and data access as a kind of explicitly political project. And so it's a term that was originally coined about 25 years ago by Nancy Peluso, an American environmental sciences professor. And she wrote an article called Whose Woods Are These? Where she basically looked at the issue of land ownership in the forests of Kalimantan, Indonesia, and found very clear differences between the forest maps drawn by the government and timber industry and those drawn by local indigenous people. And so basically what she argued was that the official maps that were drawn by the government timber industry represented lands in terms of logging and mineral exploration potential, while indigenous people's maps, which she coined here the concept of counter maps, referring to these, told stories of generations of use, about customs, and about disputes among different tribes. So since then, that was 1995, the term counter mapping has kind of taken on a much wider range of meaning and application across the social sciences especially. So for indigenous people, I should say, throughout the world, counter mapping remains a vital tool for challenging dominant representations of history and for building political identity, especially in Canada. But we're now also beginning to see other kinds of counter mapping projects pop up throughout the world. So some kind of well-known examples that I'll mention would be like the anti-eviction mapping project in San Francisco, which is basically a data visualization storytelling project that documents instances of housing dispossession and resistance gentrification. Another one is the mapping white collar crime risk zones project. And a really famous one that many criminologists are especially familiar with now is the Mapping Police Violence Project, which collects, publishes, and analyzes data on police killings across the United States. So, we were really influenced by projects like these, which we had studied before we launched this. And what our project aims to do is basically make certain police interventions, in this case, any known enforcement action related to COVID-19 across the country, visible in real time using the best data that we have available. And like the Mapping Police Violence Project, we're basically doing this because these data don't otherwise exist in any kind of central repository. And that, in turn limits the kinds of analyses and area trends and trends over time and so on that we can do, which are of course extremely important for seeking accountability and informing policy.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think for me, the way I first understood the pandemic was visually, like through global maps, like such as the Johns Hopkins website. And our map has been growing each week in a similar way, although very different. And I think we wanted to intervene in how the pandemic was visually understood, to help people understand the dual harms that are at play here. So the harm of the virus itself, but also the harm of responding to the virus with ineffective approaches that only add to the crisis, such as enforcement. And I think one of the things that emerges for us out of a visual representation of the map, which has been really helpful, is we're really quickly able to understand how enforcement was happening at intensified levels in different places, which helped bring scrutiny to it. So in places like Nova Scotia, in Quebec and Ontario, which had intensified levels of enforcement compared to other places, we could question, why is that happening in those places when it isn't happening in places like Winnipeg or Vancouver, or COVID-specific enforcements weren't happening in Winnipeg and Vancouver. Not to let the police off the hook, because in those places, there's been lots of police violence and harassment that's manifested in other ways, but it hasn't been explicitly COVID related. And so the visual representation of the map has helped us to understand that.
That's really interesting. And one of the other things that you do with the map is you break it down according to various types of legislation. So could you explain a little bit more why you think it's important to make those distinctions?
Sure, yeah, we are mobilizing an interlegal approach or an interlegality approach to our map. And so our map tracks a range of enforcement measures, which are a result of very different types of legislation that take place across a range of different jurisdictions, from federal, provincial to municipal. And the concept of interlegality allows us to understand the ongoing productive interaction and crossover between these heterogeneous legal systems. The concept was developed to account for the integrated outcomes of very legal systems operating at different scales and within different jurisdictions, using a bunch of different governing logics and rationalities, sometimes that are complementary or contradictory. So we have emergency legislation and public health legislation. And so using interlegality, we can kind of have a comprehensive understanding of these laws outside of one individual law on its own. So our project is tracking, for example, provincial emergency legislation, such as Ontario's Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. We also track provincial public health legislation, such as Quebec's Public Health Act. We're also looking at the Federal Criminal Code and the Federal Quarantine Act. The Quarantine Act was just recently used. In the past few weeks, there's been 4 charges laid under the Quarantine Act. And we also are looking at municipal bylaws, and Brampton, for example, has its own municipal bylaw that they're enforcing. And so a majority of the enforcements that we've seen to date have been failure to distance or comply with minimal gathering rules. And so each of these laws are different and has different sanctions in different places. So in Quebec, it's around a $1,500 fine that people will receive. In Ontario, it's $880. In Saskatoon, it's $2,000. Outside of physical distancing measures, the next most frequent source of enforcement action is continuing to operate a business deemed non-essential. So these businesses have been hair salons, pawn shops, nail salons, bars, a hookah lounge was closed, a massage parlor was closed. We've also seen the criminal law being used, or individuals are facing criminal charges for allegedly coughing or spitting, most often at police officers, and the threat of COVID transmission is taking place. The offense in these cases is either assaulting a police officer or aggravated assault or uttering threats. There's also been reports of individuals charged with COVID-related fraud charges under the criminal code. So someone in Toronto was charged with fraud under $5,000 for selling fake COVID testing kits. Another person was charged in Ontario for fraud under $5,000 for allegedly using a fake doctor's note stating that they had COVID to avoid coming to work. Also, in many Indigenous communities, in reserve communities across Canada, there's been curfews imposed. And so in Manitoba, there was one man who was alleged to have violated curfew, leaving the reserve after 10 p.m., and he was charged by the Manitoba First Nations Police Service. And so using the concept of interlegality helps us to understand all of these varied forms of legislation and contend with all of the various actions and the ongoing interaction and productive crossover between all of these various jurisdictions and heterogeneous laws. So we can kind of have a comprehensive picture, a comprehensive and integrated picture of the enforcement and the outcomes that result.
Awesome, thanks. Like sort of related to all of these different enforcement actions, I often see people refer to how sort of evidence supports the fact that enforcement measures, like those that your project documents, are ineffective. And you've also sort of mentioned it in this presentation. Well, I've got like a general sense of what this evidence is. Would you mind sort of filling this out with a more nuanced take on why you believe these enforcement measures are not effective?
Sure. So, I mean, when we're talking, I guess to clarify one thing, when we're talking about enforcement measures in Canada, we're really talking about monetary fines. So, I mean, this has basically been the major tool that police have been using to try to enforce physical distancing and other emergency orders, especially in Quebec, Ontario, and Nova Scotia, where most of these enforcement actions have taken place. And so with that in mind, the first kind of question we have to ask is, does fining work as a means of altering people's behavior, deterring them from doing X, in this case, standing too close to someone, because either they or someone they know or read about in the news has received some $1,500 fine. Now, we don't have these kinds of global public health crises very often, fortunately, which also means there isn't some highly developed criminological literature on fines as a means of deterring people for failing to physical distance, et cetera. In fact, it's never been studied at all from what we can tell, which leads us to the next question. Does fining work as a means of social control in other contexts, like speeding, jaywalking, or drinking in public? And from what Alex and I have found is that, you know, even in these other contexts where fines have been used for a very long time, the evidence is not really that clear. In fact, a lot of really high caliber research on speeding, drinking and driving especially has found that fines actually have little to no deterrent effect on people's behavior, even as the size of the fine actually goes up. So that would be the first point that we'd make, and I'll pass it on to Alex to make some more.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, I think we don't know if fines work, but we do know that fines cause harm. And so slapping a large fine on a homeless person who has no choice but to live their life in public without access to privacy and safety which police have already done in Montreal, Toronto, and Hamilton, that's only going to further cause harm. Imposing hefty fines on Black and Indigenous people or members of other groups who've been made oppressed or who've been made marginalized in Canada is only going to reinforce division. It's only going to reinforce mistrust, and it's only going to lead to abuse. And so also the people who had the hardest or who will have the hardest time practicing physical distancing or gathering guidelines often lack financial means. They may have mental health, language, or coherence or ability issues, where enforcement and police isn't going to be the thing that we need. Others who work in the gig economy or on the front lines of the crisis as delivery workers, as checkout people, as people who work in kitchens, as grocery workers, who are namely poor and working class people of color, these people have no choice but to be out in the world and face the dual onslaught of the crisis, of the pandemic, and the onslaught of enforcement. So meaning that they'll be at a heightened risk for COVID and at a heightened risk for facing this new ramp up of police with police or bylaw officers, depending on where you are. So those are a few of my thoughts as to why fining isn't going to do anything good for us.
I'll just add kind of one other reason that Alex and I have been kind of calling these enforcement measures into question is that there are in fact many places, even in Canada and outside of Canada, but in Canada where law enforcement and fining has hardly been used at all. And that's been one of the things that we've been able to reveal as a result of doing our project and tracking these things over time. So British Columbia, it is an example. Basically, police and bylaw officers in BC have not actually given out a single fine compared to other places like Montreal, where they've given out thousands. And yet, BC was one of the first provinces to actually flatten their curve. We can also look the other direction. We can look at countries where fines and jail time for multiple alleged offenses has been taken to the absolute extreme. For example, France. There, and I'm not sure how this is possible, but they have given out over nearly a million fines since the pandemic began, and they've jailed, I think, over 3,000 people for receiving multiple fines. But in countries like France and in Spain, which have followed a very similar model of extreme fining and enforcement, we haven't actually seen them get a better grip on the spread of the virus. So I think it's definitely not some simple linear thing where fining and enforcement helps you control the problem.
So it now seems like some cities in Canada are turning away from enforcement. So for example, the city of Toronto has adopted a stance of educating the public by issuing far more warnings than fines. Do you think that this is sufficient?
Sure, I think that's a really hard question, and I certainly, I'm not going to pretend like I have the answers, but I don't think it's enough to just focus on education if that just means telling people that they shouldn't stand too close to one another or shouldn't congregate in groups of larger than 5. I mean, I think with a focus on education by police and bylaw officers also needs to come a more well thought out messaging campaign on behalf of our governments. And in my view, definitely a fundamental reorganization of city spaces if we're going to kind of have any shot at altering our behavior to slow the spread of the virus long term. My guess is that education is going to be pretty ineffective if what we're trying to teach people is just don't do that because the law says not to. I think people need to understand why they should take physical distancing seriously. They need to understand certain risks of specific behaviors versus others. They need to have a clear kind of, as unambiguous as possible guidelines about how they should navigate and use public space. And ultimately, I think we do need to work a lot harder to foster a sense of togetherness in Canada, which things like the Snitch Lines popping up all over Ontario, of course, directly undermine. So I would say that education is only a small part of this. The rest would fall to our governments, doctors, epidemiologists, other experts to come up with a clear overarching strategy and plan that they communicate to people, which they have not yet to do, at least in Ontario and Quebec.
Yeah, Thanks, Alex. Many places made appeals to use the police as a last resort in this crisis. Like, for example, in Nova Scotia, the medical officer of health said, we'll use police as a last resort. And they were actually then one of the first provinces to use police. So I don't know what the term of a last resort would be, but for me, it's not about if or when we use the police. It's that the police are fundamentally the wrong institution to mobilize at all. And so many of these emergency laws that we've seen, they also allow for jail time under public health acts or emergency acts if fines aren't paid or if there are repeated fines. So for example, we saw this or we've seen this, the threat of this in the Cree community in Shisabi in northern Quebec, where 15 Indigenous people were issued tickets of $1,000 for allegedly disobeying physical distancing rules. And multiple people then received second tickets just for a few days after the first violation, with a threat of jail for the third violation. And I think this is a particularly troubling thing, and it reveals how quickly public health coercion and a carceral logic unfold to become one and the same. And I think this is a kind of logic that quickly becomes illogical. Lock people in a crowded cage during a communicable disease pandemic for not physical distancing, where they will not be able to physical distancing. This is not public health policy that's going to be effective. And I think the default for the use of the criminal justice system and police as a legitimate actor in the response to this community health crisis is what needs to be put into question. And it's what needs to be undone. The police and the criminal justice system are fundamentally institutions that are not designed to handle or manage health crises. In fact, they're only going to drive them to be worse. So we've seen this with the criminalization of HIV. It's a prime example. Unlike effective HIV prevention approaches, which emphasize community behavior change, policing discourages testing, drives people away from healthcare. And while many people around the world, or many countries around the world, have reduced HIV transmission, Canada's HIV transmission continue to be on the rise, and police have only created an ongoing context of fear and uncertainty for the 65,000 people who live with the virus in the country. So it's not an effective approach, and it's fundamentally the wrong institution to handle this crisis.
Thanks, Alex. A minute ago, it was mentioned about these snitch lines or COVID-19 reporting lines that have emerged, and your project started to track these as well. Could you maybe share a little bit more about how these snitch lines relate to the broader context of enforcement?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jamie. So yeah, police began relying early on in the crisis on people reporting on each other. And they began publicizing non-compliance lines to get people to essentially crowdsource policing to help in the process of enforcement. For us, it was really through talking with sex worker rights activists that we learned the important role of snitch lines. As there are certain communities who are always targets outside of the pandemic of community forms of snitching and reporting, such as homeless people and sex workers. And we saw this in Quebec City. A brothel was shut down during the pandemic, and people who worked there were ticketed under the Public Health Act in Quebec for over $1,500 for being alleged to not physically distance because they were snitched on. So this was because of a reporting of non-compliance. In some cities, there's been billboards encouraging people to snitch. And so we knew that the rise of snitching was a really important force in relation to enforcement, and we needed to start accounting for this factor. So we developed a map on these, which is available on our website as well.
Yeah, and the snitch line phenomenon is something that we hope will be examined further in future research, which is a major reason that we kind of started tracking them, because for us it raises a ton of questions that I don't think as criminologists we have very well developed answers to. So for instance, why do people snitch in these particular cases? Is it out of a sense of civic duty? Is it because they're looking for ways to add some certainty to their lives? Like, what is the exact the different motivations? And I think we also have to kind of ask, why have so many governments launched these formal snitch lines? We've once we started tracking it, we found over 30 of these initiatives across Canada, most of them in Southern Ontario. And one hypothesis is that police want the extra intel, which is certainly seems to be the case in places like Edmonton, where the police are actually using geolocated snitch line calls to orient hotspot policing. So just kind of mobilizing more police resources to the places that are generating the most calls. And of course, another hypothesis though is that when we look to other places, we've seen a lot of police agencies concerned about the overwhelming influx in non-serious 911 calls related to COVID non-compliance that they're getting. And so this kind of raises some questions about what's actually driving it, because it could very well be that many governments launch these lines to redirect unwanted traffic away from 911, which might suggest that it's actually being driven more by everyday people wanting to call these things in than governments asking them to report. So I think these are the types of questions that we think will be really important to examine in the coming months and years as we try to make sense of all of this. And I hope that our project and the data that we've made available will help people do that.
Really interesting. And I think that some recent events in Toronto are sort of related to this theme. Over the weekend, Twitter blew up with photos of crowds at Trinity Bellwoods Park of people not adhering to social distancing measures, including the mayor, John Tory. I've seen a few takes on this in the news. So for the Toronto Star, Shri Pradkar noted that mostly white COVIDiots at Trinity Bellwoods think the rules don't apply to them. They're right. In the Globe and Mail, Haley Montgomery and Jesse Wilms said, "Don't blame those who gather in parks, blame the city for not having enough public space." In response to these events, the city of Toronto ramped up visible enforcement presence and promised to strictly enforce bylaws around social distancing. So I'm wondering, what's your take on this situation, and how could Canadian cities do a better job at encouraging responsible behavior?
Yeah, thanks. It was certainly a troubling image to see, and I think there's probably some truth to all of the different takes that you mentioned. And again, I'm not going to pretend like I have the answers to this, but the big question for me in kind of reacting to it would be, how can we avoid this from happening again in the future as we continue to manage the situation? And I think, a lot of people on social media have tried to take to what we might call pandemic shaming in response to this particular event, and maybe that's going to be effective. I have no idea, but I certainly don't think that the answer would be a return to enforcement via fines and arrests just because of this one incident in the park. I think, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a real retreat away from finding enforcement by police and by law, including in Toronto, in New York City, a number of other places across Canada. And I would hope that it would stay that way. Because, for us, this is basically not fundamentally a criminal justice problem. At least in the case of Trinity Bellwoods Park incident, it seems to be primarily an education messaging problem, perhaps also a privilege problem that largely falls in the hands of our government's leaders to effectively solve. And I think solving it is going to require some more imagination beyond just, let's launch a bunch of new snitch lines and boost the presence of police in parks and other public spaces. For me, that it's hard to imagine how that would be a sustainable and effective solution.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. And policing is not an equal opportunity institution. And I think Shri Pardkar's response highlights this well. Patterns of enforcement are racialized. And so, of course, police were not in a park frequented primarily by white people. Through our ticketing or through our tracking, we've seen multiple instances where people of color have been the targets of COVID-19 enforcement. In Ottawa, a bylaw officer punched a Black man in the face because he refused to give his name while being asked to leave a public park that was apparently closed. The man was with his daughter and said that the enforcement officer singled him out in a park full of others. Also in Ottawa, 2 Syrian refugees were ticketed while being in with their families in parks having picnics, and ticketed $880. And we've seen other forms of this across the country. And at the same time, I think also I agree with Alex. Much of the response to shaming people in Trinity Bellwoods reminds me of the phenomenon of snitch lines. And I think what that effectively does is it individualizes the response and deflects from the lack of preparedness, education, and testing on behalf of the government to actually handle this crisis effectively.
Thanks, Alex. So all of these themes that we've been discussing, you've published in a series of reports, and your enforcement reports have gotten quite a bit of attention. Could you tell us what your goals were in producing these reports and what some of your key findings were?
Yeah. So since we started the project beginning of April 4th, and since then we've released 2 of what we call enforcement reports. The first looking at the available data in our project between April 4th and which is basically when police intervention related to COVID-19 started in Canada, and April 15th. And then the second one looks at the data between April 4th and May 1st. So we started producing these reports, which are both available on the website, as a way to analyze kind of macro level trends across the country and draw attention to particular enforcement related incidents that we wanted to make people aware of. So in the reports, we took stock of available information in the database, looking at things like which provinces and cities were using police the most, what kinds of actions were they taking in response to COVID related incidents, how many people have been given tickets for things like failing physical distance, and also trying to determine whether any evidence of unequal patterns of enforcement had begun to emerge, such as poor, Black, and Indigenous people being targeted more than other groups, something that we know happens in other areas of policing like street checks. But so far, this last one has been difficult to fully assess just due to the limits of our data, but we're still working on it.
Yeah, and so far we've counted over 4,500 people facing fines across the country. Approximately 30 people are facing criminal charges, and fines have totaled upwards of $5.8 million. And so one of the things about the enforcement reports, I think that's been important for us, is that our project is public facing first and foremost, and that means it's meant for people. It's a form of public criminology. Many people and communities have been using the site as a public service. We presented findings to groups of sex workers, to shelter workers, to drug users' rights activists, and to communities so they can use the knowledge that we've kind of aggregated together to help understand this new rise in pandemic police power as a way to protect their own communities. Someone posted one of our enforcement reports in a store window in downtown Toronto. Journalists have been using the site regularly as a source. And it's, for me, it's interesting because I was talking to my colleague, Kira Bracken-Roach, who's in Ireland. And she was telling me that in Ireland, the public police oversight body is doing what we're doing. They're collecting numbers and locations of new COVID enforcement measures. And for us, I think it's fascinating that this brand new form of police power, which is unprecedented in our lifetime, has been enacted with little or no oversight. There's no interest in terms of documenting what's going on, as far as we know. And so that's where our project comes in. And I think that's where our project has been helpful. It's to help inform, help scrutinize, and hopefully eventually help hold to account what's been happening.
And why do you think that this work has resonated with so many people? You sort of allude to it, but could you expand a little bit?
Well, yeah, the project has really resonated with people because I think people are at a point where they don't want more surveillance and policing in their daily lives, and that's reached kind of a crisis point. But we've had politicians reach out to us. We've been engaging very actively with the media on a regular basis, and journalists have used our site regularly as a source. We've also written an op-ed about the problem of fines, specifically in Montreal and Quebec, where that's been the biggest problem. And for us, it's been really helpful, and for other communities, it's really helpful to document in kind of near real time this new form of enforcement to help kind of inform an ongoing conversation of what's actually happening. And for example, in Ottawa, due to lots of public scrutiny, the city has now reversed the use of enforcement. And that many people have pushed for this to happen. And I think having a source to call upon really helped that collective work move it forward.
That's great. So like a real impact that you can see. Before we close it up, what's next for the map?
We have a few next steps for the project. We're going to continue what we're doing. So we're going to continue tracking the forms of enforcement so people can continue to check our website at policingthepandemic.ca. We're going to continue releasing enforcement reports. And we're also developing a timeline of laws and enforcement measures that Nicholas Behuit at U of T, a law student there, has been helping us with. Thank you, Nicholas. And Alex, we have some other stuff that Alex can talk about.
Yeah, the other really big one is that, and this will hopefully come soon, but at the moment, if you go to the website, we basically have the interactive map of geolocated police enforcement actions and Snitch Lines, then the searchable database as well. But we would also like to make the data available in raw format. So in doing this, we'd also like to release several other data points that we've been collecting, like the size of the fine, the known latitude, longitude coordinates, the more precise incident descriptions, which are all kind of things that we've been collecting behind the scenes, but not yet released. So we'd like to compile all of this into a file that we can just update along with the map and database that people can directly download with a kind of short description of the methodology, the limitations of the data, an overview of the different variables, and we'll hopefully have that out soon. Basically, we're just having somebody triple check it with the kind of amazing help of Emily Simmons at the University of Ottawa, who's kind of very carefully going through everything and making sure we didn't make any mistakes. We're doing a bit of cleaning to it, but we hope in the next couple of weeks that all of that data will be directly downloadable for people to do what they want with.
Awesome. So just one more time, I'd love to thank Alex Luscombe and Alexander McClelland for joining us to tell us a little bit more about the Policing the Pandemic project. I think there's going to be a link below, but you can check out their work at policingthepandemic.ca. So thanks again to both of you.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you, Jamie. Thanks, Marcus.
Yeah, thanks, Marcus. Thanks, Jamie.